two authors on the Prophet Muhammad and the nature of Islam. Our back-to-back programs begin at 3:30 p.m. Eastern with Robert Spencer, who argues that Islam is the world's most intolerant religion. That'll be followed by Karen Armstrong, who argues that Muhammad taught his followers respect and tolerance for other faiths. Tonight on Book TV, Warlord, former Marine Ilario Pantano on morality, American society, and the war in Iraq. At 10 p.m. Eastern, Executive Secrets, William Doherty on covert action and the American presidency. And at 3:30 a.m. Eastern, a panel on the legality of Google's print program, which would make the books of major libraries available online. In The Truth About Muhammad, Jihad Watch director Robert Spencer argues that Islam justifies jihad and terrorism and is the world's most intolerant religion. This talk from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. is about an hour.
Clearly, one of the earliest lessons of the 21st century is how ignorant we in the West are of major religions of the world. Today, we hope to spread some light on one of those, Islam, its founder, and what we need to learn more about in this modern time. Our featured speaker is Robert Spencer. Mr. Spencer is a writer and researcher. He has written 6 books, 8 monographs, and well over 100 articles about jihad and Islamic terrorism. He earned his master's degree in religious studies from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and has been studying Islamic theology, law, and history in depth for over a quarter of a century. Mr. Spencer serves as director of Judicial Watch, a project of the Jihad Watch, I knew I was going to get off onto Larry and his group. Serves as director of Jihad Watch, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and he also serves as an adjunct fellow with the Free Congress Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Spencer. Bob?
Thank you very much.
Be sure you say Jihad Watch again.
Jihad Watch.
So David will be happy.
Thank you very much. A great deal is invested today in public policy in both the United States and Europe in the proposition that there is an overwhelming majority of Muslims who abhor and reject the jihad terrorism that we see in the world today and who are naturally our allies and will eagerly act as such. And there is a great deal of truth to that. At the same time, however, it is also true that jihad terrorists are making use on an international basis of texts of the Quran and teachings of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, in order to recruit terrorists and justify their actions according to Islamic law within the Muslim community. Now, this presents a paradox that I think can only be unraveled and a way forward only be mapped out by reference to those texts themselves and to the teachings of Islam, which will in themselves reveal what we can reasonably expect from the American Muslim community, from Muslim communities in the West in general, and from Islamic states around the world. And a lot of this centers, of course, around the person of Muhammad. The Quran and Islamic tradition are quite clear and emphatic that he is the supreme example of behavior for Muslims to follow. The importance of Muhammad for hundreds of millions of Muslims worldwide is rooted in the Quran's statement that he is an excellent example of conduct, uswa hasana, which is in the 33rd chapter of the Quran, and that he demonstrates an exalted standard of character. The Quran even goes on to say that he who obeys Muhammad obeys Allah. This is something that any devout Muslim will take quite seriously. Muqtada Khan of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy put it this way. He said, "No religious leader has as much influence on his followers as does Muhammad, the last prophet of Islam. Muhammad, as the final messenger of God, enjoys preeminence when it comes to revelation, the Quran, and traditions. So much so that the words, deeds, and even the silences, that which he saw and did not forbid of Muhammad, become an independent source of Islamic law." So says Muqtadar Khan, and in that he reflects the mainstream of Islamic tradition about the status of Muhammad. Now, it is also true that mujahideen, warriors of jihad around the world today, look to Muhammad and invoke his example to justify what they're doing. For example, as late as November 2003, the website of the Islamic Affairs Department of the Saudi Arabian Embassy here in Washington contained exhortations to Muslims to wage violent jihad warfare in imitation of Muhammad, and said the Muslims are required to raise the banner of jihad in order to make the word of Allah supreme in this world. Similarly, in December 2003, an Iraqi jihad warrior explained why he was fighting with American troops there in Iraq. And he said, the religious principle is that we cannot accept to live with infidels. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, hit the infidels wherever you find them, which is, of course, a quote not from Muhammad himself, but from the Quran, the celebrated verse of the sword, chapter 9, verse 5, which does say in part, slay the infidels wherever you find them. Fawaz bin Muhammad al-Nashami, who was the commander of a jihad group that killed 22 people in a jihad attack in Khobar, Saudi Arabia, on May 29, 2004, explained very clearly that he was acting in accord with what he saw to be the Prophet Muhammad's directives for the Arabian Peninsula. He said, we are mujahideen, and we want the Americans. We have not come to aim a weapon at the Muslims, but to purge the Arabian Peninsula according to the will of our Prophet Muhammad, of the infidels and polytheists who are killing our brothers in Afghanistan and Iraq. We began to comb the site looking for infidels. We found Filipino Christians. We cut their throats and dedicated them to our brothers, the Mujahideen, in the Philippines. Likewise, we found Hindu engineers and cut their throats too, Allah be praised. That same day, we purged Muhammad's land of many Christians and polytheists. Just before the 2004 presidential election, a Muslim preacher said, our prophet did not run for office in any election. He did not win any political debate. Instead, he won the war against the infidel. The examples multiply virtually with every new headline, every new news story coming out particularly of the Islamic world. In January 2005, in Arab News, the columnist Adil Salahi reminded his readers that Muhammad never waged war against a people without first inviting them to Islam. And he said, during the Prophet's lifetime, the Muslim community had to fight many battles. The Prophet made sure that in none of these battles, the Muslims would exceed the limits of what was lawful in Islam. He would not launch an attack without alerting the enemy and calling upon them to accept Islam and live in peace with the Muslim state. In accord with precisely those directives, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, recently sent a letter to President Bush, which he later explained to an Indonesian audience was indeed his invitation to Bush to accept Islam. And then he told Mike Wallace that, during his celebrated interview with Wallace, that the president, of course, had free will, but he should understand that if an invitation is refused, there are negative consequences. London Muslim leader Hani al-Sabahi in February 2005 justified the slaughters being perpetrated by the Mujahideen of Zarqawi in Iraq at that time. And he said, do these people base themselves on Islamic law or not? And then he answered his own question. He said, the Prophet told the Quraysh tribe, I have brought slaughter upon you. The Prophet drove nails into and gouged out the eyes of the people from the Uraina tribe. They were merely a group of thieves who stole from sheep herders, and the Prophet drove nails into them and threw them into the Al-Harara area and left them there to die. He blinded them, cut off their opposite legs and arms. This is what the Prophet did on a trifling matter, let alone in war. Now, these, of course, are all quotations, and I could give you many more, from Islamic spokesmen today. And of course, we have all heard that these people have actually twisted and hijacked the message of Islam, which is essentially and fundamentally peaceful. And yet, constantly, they invoke, again and again, the example of Muhammad, and they invoke quotations from the Quran. If you read, for example, Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, in which he himself invites us to accept Islam, on November 24th, 2002, you will find copious quotations from the Quran, invocations of principles of Islamic law. Now, this poses a challenge for peaceful Muslims, Muslim reformers, moderate Muslims, in the United States and around the world. Because this material is being used by the Islamic Jihad terrorists, it is incumbent upon Muslims who do genuinely abhor the terrorism that we see perpetrated in the name of Islam in the world today to stand up and speak out against these elements of Islam that are giving rise to these things and these understandings of the Islamic teachings and of the Quran that are being used to justify violence and terror. It is unfortunately untrue that the jihadists are a tiny minority of extremists who have hijacked the religion. The texts of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the madhahib, are very clear that it is incumbent upon the Islamic community, the ummah, worldwide, to wage war against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they either convert to Islam or submit under the rule of Islamic law. This is something that is shared among all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence and not rejected by any of those that are considered orthodox in the Islamic world. These things and many others arising from the example of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran as they are understood in mainstream Islam are precisely the elements of Islam that need to be confronted by reformers. All too often, however, in contrast, we hear from moderate Muslims that these elements of Islam do not actually exist, and that the people who are calling attention to them are bigots or hate mongers or something of the kind. Now, you know, there is religious bigotry. For example, in the mid-19th century, the nativist movement in the United States tried to perpetrate the idea that the Pope of Rome was planning to gain control over the United States through the Irish Catholic immigrants who were streaming into the country at the time. Later in the 19th century, in Russia, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were written, which of course is a completely fictional account of a meeting of high-level Jewish leaders who were plotting a large-scale conspiracy to control the world. Both of those things are indeed examples of bigotry and of hate-mongering, but they are such because they have one thing in common. They're fictional. There was no plot of the Pope to gain control over the United States. There was no meeting of the Elders of Zion to control the world. However, I have just given you a number of statements by Muslims themselves, and there are many others that are readily available. You find that it is not at all difficult, if you monitor the press coming out of the Islamic world, to find Muslim leaders invoking Quran, Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, and the example of Muhammad to justify warfare in the name of Islam, ultimately with the goal of establishing the hegemony of Islamic law over the world. Now, you can't fix what you won't admit is broken. You cannot reform what you say doesn't need reforming. These are elements of Islam that need confrontation and reform by peaceful Muslims if there's ever going to be an end to their being put to use to justify violence. And for the next few minutes, I wanted to focus on three ways in which Muhammad is, in his words and deeds, are being used today in a deleterious fashion and in a way that needs attention by Islamic reformers. The first is in the case of child marriage. Now, this is a very unpleasant subject, but according to Islamic tradition, recorded in the collection that Muslims consider most reliable, the Hadith of the Imam Bukhari, compiled in the 9th century, the Prophet of Islam married Aisha, his last and favorite wife, when she, actually not his last, but indeed his favorite wife, when she was a girl of 6 years of age, and he consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old. He was at this time in his early 50s. Now, I don't think it's fair to say on that basis that Muhammad was guilty of pedophilia. Pedophilia as a psychological or sociological category did not exist in 7th century Arabia. There was no standard by which he could be judged that would condemn that activity at his time. Child marriage was very common. He was not the first person to engage in marriage with a child. He was not the last. He was not the only one. And nobody in his day criticized him for contracting this marriage. However, because he is the excellent example of conduct, because there is no moral standard higher in traditional Islam than what Muhammad said and did, this is something in which his example has caused trouble. For example, the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, when he took power in Iran in 1979, he made sure that there passed, rather quickly, Article 1041 of the Civil Code of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which stipulates that the marriageable age, the legal marriageable age of girls is 9. And this is an invitation of the Prophet. Khomeini himself married a 10-year-old when he was 28, and he advised in one of his many writings that marriage to a prepubescent girl was a divine blessing, and advised it as a model to follow. Unfortunately, Khomeini was not alone. In Yemen, an attempt by religious conservatives, so to speak, to abolish Yemen's legal minimum age of 15 for girls failed a few years back. They were trying to lower it from 15 down to something that was in line with Muhammad's example. They failed, but unfortunately, people on the ground in Yemen say that it is rarely enforced anyway, and child marriage is quite common. Meanwhile, the United Nations Children's Fund reports that over half the girls in Afghanistan and Bangladesh are married before they reach the age of 18. In 2002, when researchers entered refugee camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan after the Taliban was toppled there in Afghanistan, they found that more than 2 out of 3 of the girls of second grade age were already married. And this is in line with the example of Muhammad. This is, unfortunately, a price that women have paid throughout Islamic history and continue to pay for Muhammad's example as an excellent model for conduct. Secondly, and of course, much more vivid for us today, particularly after 9/11, is warfare. According to Muhammad's earliest biographer, Ibn Ishaq, and this is something that became part of the mainstream understanding of the Quran, is also reflected in Quranic commentators, including Ibn Kathir, Ibn Juzai, the Tafsir al-Jalalain, and others that are read today and studied in madrasas around the world. The Quranic teaching about war came in 3 stages. When Muhammad first began preaching, he was nothing more than that, a preacher. And he taught tolerance. The 109th chapter of the Quran is all about that. The Quran is not arranged chronologically, but rather from the longest chapter to the shortest, with the exception of the first. And so, as it turns out, as a general rule, what is revealed earlier comes toward the end of the book because they tended to be shorter revelations earlier in his prophetic career. In any case, the 109th chapter of the Quran says to the unbelievers that you have your religion and we have ours. You will not believe what we believe and we will not believe what you believe, and basically we're going to leave each other alone. However, unfortunately, later he began to receive what he represented as divine revelations that first taught that he could wage defensive warfare to defend the Islamic community that was at that time in its infancy, and finally to wage offensive warfare to establish the hegemony of the laws of his new community over non-Muslims. This is not forced conversion. Forced conversion was forbidden. It is actually inaccurate to say Islam was spread by the sword, but Islamic law was spread by the sword. The rule of the law that he stipulated was the law of Allah. That was spread by the sword. Now, that did not mandate conversion for non-Muslims, but it did mandate their second-class status as inferiors without equality of rights before the law. Muhammad urged on and participated in this warfare. He himself fought in several battles. And also, he wrote a series of letters which I think are highly illuminating, to some of the great leaders of his day. Arabia, of course, was surrounded more or less by 2 great empires, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Persian Empire. And he did write to, among others, the emperors of both of those. In his letter to Heraclius, the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople, he wrote this: "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, this letter is from Muhammad, the slave of Allah and his messenger, to Heraclius, the ruler of the Byzantines. Peace be upon him who follows the true guidance." An aside is, it's interesting to note that in Islamic law, "Assalamu alaikum," peace be upon you, is the greeting that one Muslim should give to another, but it's forbidden to give it to a non-Muslim. You don't wish a non-Muslim peace, you say peace be upon those who follow the right guidance. to a non-Muslim. In other words, peace be upon the Muslims only. And this is how Muhammad addressed Heraclius. Incidentally, this is also how Mahmoud Ahmadinejad wrote to President Bush in his invitation to Islam. It also begins in exactly the same way, peace be upon those who follow the right guidance. In any case, Muhammad then goes on to say, now then, I invite you to Islam. Embrace Islam, and you will be safe. Now that's a clear threat. Embrace Islam, and you will be safe. Presumably then, Heraclius and his people would not be safe if they did not embrace Islam. He wrote to some others more clearly, more specifically, embrace Islam, and your lives and your property will be safe. But if you do not embrace Islam, then there's no guarantee for either one, your lives or your property. Heraclius, of course, did not accept Islam, and the Byzantines were not safe. Shortly after Muhammad's death, the Islamic armies, motivated by these kinds of teachings of Muhammad, poured out of Arabia and overwhelmed the Byzantine provinces surrounding Arabia, which now have become the heart of the Islamic world, including Syria and Egypt and on into North Africa. And of course, they pressed into Spain and besieged Constantinople by the year 717, although it would be another 700 years before they would actually succeed in conquering Constantinople as well. Muhammad did not get a satisfactory answer either from Khosroes, the ruler of the Persians. It is said that after reading the letter he received from Muhammad, Khosroes tore it into small bits. And when news of this reached Muhammad, he called upon Allah to tear the Persian Empire and its emperor into small bits. And he said, when Khosroes perishes, there will be no more after him. And when Caesar perishes, there will be no more Caesar after him. By him in whose hand Muhammad's life is, you will spend the treasures of both of them in Allah's cause. And indeed in that he turned out to be correct. That is what happened. He received a revelation from Allah, chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, that commanded Muslims to fight even Jews and Christians, the people of the book, as they are denoted in the Quran, until they accepted Islamic hegemony, symbolized by payment of a poll tax called the jizya, and discriminatory regulations that would ensure that they would be constantly reminded of their subordinate position. It says that the Muslims must fight those who believe not in Allah or the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. He told his followers to offer these unbelievers conversion to Islam just as he had offered to the emperors. And if they refused, to offer them the opportunity to pay tribute as vassals of the Islamic State, and if they refused that also, to go to war. And he said this, according to an Islamic tradition, fight in the name of Allah and in the way of Allah. Fight against those who disbelieve in Allah. When you meet your enemies who are polytheists, invite them to 3 courses of action. If they respond to any one of these, you also accept it, and withhold yourself from doing them any harm. Invite them to accept Islam. If they respond to you, accept it from them and desist from fighting against them. If they refuse to accept Islam, demand from them the jizya. If they agree to pay, accept it from them and hold off your hands. If they refuse to pay the tax, seek Allah's help and fight them. Conversion, subjugation, or war. Those are the 3 choices that are offered by the word of Muhammad himself. Now, obviously, there are Muslims in the world today who are happy to live in Western societies, pluralistic societies, and are not at all interested in offering unbelievers conversion, subjugation, or war. But here again, because these texts exist, and because they are not dead letters that I dug out of dusty old books in a library, but are rather quoted and invoked by Islamic spokesmen around the world today, these things are being used as instruments of recruitment to place moderate Muslims on the defensive, to portray them as having strayed from the purity of Islam, and to call them back to the fullness of the Islamic observance on their basis. This has happened even in the United States. In Lackawanna, New York, there was a celebrated case a few years ago where some young men who were 3rd or 4th generation Yemeni Muslims, very, very secularized, very Americanized, they were approached by a gentleman who was, in fact, a Saudi Wahhabi recruiter. He had been born in the United States, but had lived in Saudi Arabia from the age of 3, and then returned. And he came to these men and he said, he won them over, he got them to join a Quranic study group, and he presented it to them. Look, you're on the way to hell. You're living with your girlfriend, you're drinking alcohol, whatever, how are you going to expiate that? Well, the Prophet Muhammad was approached and asked, is there any deed, tell me the name of some deed that is greater than jihad. And he said, I do not know of such a deed. And when he said jihad, this is, of course, how the presentation was made to these young men. He did not mean a spiritual struggle within the soul of the believer. He meant warfare against the unbelievers. And he got 6 of them to go to Central Asia to try to join up with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and fight against Americans, on the basis of trying to do some great deed that was good to expiate for all the evil deeds that they had done, and invoking Muhammad and the Quran and Islamic teachings to justify this. Now, the Jews and Christians in the traditional Islamic law who agreed to pay the jizya were known as the protected people, the dhimmis. The protection comes because as people of the book they have received genuine revelations, the book, from Allah, and thus differ in status from out-and-out pagans and idolaters such as the Hindus and Buddhists in this view. Historically, the latter two groups were treated even worse by Islamic conquerors. The bloodshed in India was immense until ultimately, as a practical matter, the conquerors of India granted the Hindus dhimmi status, which allowed them to live, although without equality of rights under the law, within the Islamic polity. Now, the Jews and Christians and the others who have the dhimmi status may live in Islamic states, but not as equals of the Muslims. One Muslim jurist explained that the Caliph, the leader of the Islamic community, up until 1924, must make jihad against those who resist Islam after having been called to it until they submit or accept to live as a protected dhimmi community, so that Allah's rights may he be exalted, so that Allah's rights, may he be exalted, may be made uppermost above any other religion. Now, this is obviously something that is completely at variance with the pluralistic model of modern Western societies, and does not at all bode well if people are fighting, as they are, to reinstitute this law around the world. It doesn't bode well for particularly the equality of rights of religious minorities in Islamic countries even now. Still, however, there is great hope for negotiated settlements. There is an increasing call, for example, for talks now with Iran, and an ongoing pressure on Western governments to initiate and consummate talks with the Palestinian Authority. Here again, Muhammad's example, I think, is very much worth consulting. And this is encapsulated by the key Islamic principles that were formulated by the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. In 628, toward the end of his career, Muhammad had a vision that he wanted to perform the pilgrimage in Mecca, but Mecca was still under the control of the pagan Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's own tribe, which had rejected his status as a prophet. And so he decided to enter into negotiations with the Quraysh to arrange for the Muslims to be able, and particularly for Muhammad himself, to be able to make the pilgrimage. Now, when he met with the Quraysh, he agreed to Quraysh demands that Allah not be invoked in the treaty, and that Muhammad not be identified as Allah's prophet. He said, write this down to the scribe, and he said, Muhammad, the apostle of Allah, agrees to this, and the Quraysh negotiator stopped him and said, wait a minute, if I thought you were the apostle of Allah, I wouldn't have gone to war with you. And he said, okay, strike it out, say Muhammad the son of Abdullah agrees to this. And he agreed to all these disadvantageous elements of the treaty. For example, he shocked his men by agreeing that if anybody fled from the Quraysh to the Muslims would return them to the Quraysh. But if anybody fled from the Muslims to the Quraysh would not have to return them. His followers were very upset about this treaty, and he reassured them, he told them that better days were ahead. Ultimately, their fears would be assuaged. A woman of the Quraysh, Kulthum, joined the Muslims at their base in Medina. Her two brothers came to Muhammad asking that she be returned to them in accordance with the agreement between him and the Quraysh at Hudaybiyah. But Muhammad refused. He actually had received a divine revelation, refusing, that is in the Quran today. And it says, O you who believe, when there come to you believing women refugees, examine and test them. Allah knows best as to their faith. If you ascertain that they are believers, then do not send them back to the unbelievers, which effectively broke the treaty. In refusing to send this woman back, he did break the treaty. And although Islamic apologists have claimed throughout history that the Quraysh broke it first, this incident came before all that the Quraysh invoke as having been treaty violations. Now, all those incidents all those actions by the Quraysh that are supposed to have been treaty violations. Now, this set many dangerous precedents that are enshrined in Islamic law. In the first place, if you read the manuals of Islamic law, you will find that a treaty is not to be entered into unless there are two conditions. One is that Muslims are weak and need time to gather strength to fight again more effectively. Or, and this is the second one, if they have a reasonable expectation that their foes will become Muslims. Only in those cases are treaties to be entered into, and then only for a temporary period up to 10 years, renewable after 10 years, but still kept on a temporary basis. There is no provision in Islamic law for a treaty to be based on the idea that two sides are weary of fighting and want to establish peaceful coexistence in full harmony with one another. It is only on those bases. Now, I think this would be a very useful thing to keep in mind, actually, when there are calls, as there have been recently, for treaties on the part of Palestinian groups, as also from al-Qaeda itself. But because of, I think, a general unawareness and an indifference to the elements of Islam that are being used by these pious Muslims as their guides to action, these things go by Western analysts and policymakers. They assume that these things are not really being taken seriously because they don't take them seriously. And so they miss a chance to understand a great deal of the motives and the goals and the strategies of the jihad terrorists who are working according to these principles. And this is true in the response to Ahmadinejad's letter to the president, which imitated very closely Muhammad's letters to the emperors. And this is true in the case of the treaties. And it is true in numerous other ways. Unfortunately, at least in any public way, the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, none of them have undertaken any systematic study of Islamic theology and law or the words and deeds of Muhammad to understand what those things might show us about the motives and goals of the terrorists. None of it is being done. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, we should respect our opponents enough to take their statements as they have come to us, and to understand that when they tell us their motives, we should take them seriously. When they tell us this is why we are doing what we are doing, we should use that as an opportunity to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Now that would lead, of course, to certain policy implications. We have the president having said, after 9/11, you're either with the terrorists or you're with us. And yet the chief enabler of terrorism around the world is still counted as an American ally. This is a scandal of immense proportions, and I think it comes into a great degree from a misunderstanding of these elements of Islam that are fueling this fanaticism and violence today. We have also billions of dollars going, even without the question of oil, which complicates everything, billions of dollars going to states like Egypt and Pakistan, which are both allowing their mosques and schools to teach Islamic supremacism, warfare against Jews and Christians, anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, hatred of the West, and they're not being called upon it. If the president were to say that we are in a defensive action against Islamic jihadists who are, whether they're true Muslims or not, whether Islam is a religion of peace or not, they are working according to these principles with these goals, then if you teach these principles and these goals in your mosques and schools, you are no friend of the United States and will not get a penny of American aid. It would seem to me that would be a little bit more effective to combat this threat in the long term. We need also to call American Muslim groups to account. There is, 5 years after 9/11, although many protestations have been made that these groups are against terrorism, there's no organized nationwide effort to teach Muslims in mosques against the jihad ideology, to teach them how to resist the jihad recruiters, who come to them in person or over the internet or in any number of ways and make, on the basis of Quran and the teachings of Muhammad, a case that this is what they ought to be doing as Muslims, to be loyal Muslims. There's no comprehensive effort to combat that. And many, of course, questionable elements of many of these groups, which have had people, of their officials, arrested and convicted of terrorism-related activities. I would ask of these allegedly moderate Muslim groups, how is it that you hired these people? If your vision of Islam is so different from theirs, how is it that they got by your vetting process? You didn't ask them about the most pressing issues in the globe or all around the world today? This immense crisis is engulfing the Islamic world, and you didn't talk about it? This kind of double game has to be called, but in order to do that, there has to be a resolute rejection of the relativist and politically correct multiculturalism that has just spread a fog over the public discourse today and strangled honest discussion of these issues that have to be addressed if we are going to meet this threat effectively. People say, if you talk about this, then you'll be aiding a clash of civilizations. Well, you know something? I don't have to aid a clash of civilizations. It's already happening. I didn't make it up. People talk to me about these things all the time. A Muslim professor wrote to me recently and he said, I hear you are continuing your shameless lies. Now you are saying Muhammad married his daughter-in-law. Well, you know, Muhammad married his daughter-in-law. That's referred to in the Quran, chapter 33, verse 37. It is attested in numerous hadith, traditions of Muhammad. It is in the earliest biographies of Muhammad. It is in the earliest histories written by pious Muslims. But the fog of deception is so thick that this gentleman thinks he can get away with acting as if I, through my black Zionist arts, have cast it into these books somehow and made millions of Muslims around the world believe it. Now this in microcosm is what we're facing in all discussions of terrorism and the jihad around the world today. People are so anxious to believe falsehoods and half-truths, and people are so uninformed about these issues that they are falling for deceptions of the most naked kind. This has to stop, or the clash of civilizations will certainly be upon us, and we will not be the victors. Thank you very much.
We will have some time for questions. As always, we have microphones that we would ask you to wait for so that our audience outside the building can also hear your question. And as they always say on Jeopardy, we would indeed appreciate it in the form of a question. And we would ask the courtesy of at least identifying your self-name or some affiliation, even if it's nothing more than John Smith, Washington, D.C. That would be helpful. And I'll start back at the back.
Matthew Ballin, Heritage Alum. You said in the Iranian premier's letter to President Bush that he had free will in the matter to convert to Islam. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that comment, because I thought that there was no free will according to Islamic teaching.
Well, that's actually something that throughout Islamic history, going back to the earliest days, has been a point of controversy, because there are many quotations in the Quran that teach free will, and many that teach an absolute determinism. And there was a very large schism and controversy over the Qadaris in early Islam who taught that there was free will, and they ultimately were the losers in the controversy. However, there is generally accepted, particularly from someone who's not speaking as a theologian, but speaking as a pious layman, as Ahmadinejad was, I believe, generally accepted the idea that there is free will, and that certainly the choice must be made. But he also said, as I noted, that there are consequences for the negative choice, in which I believe he was referring to Muhammad's dictum that one follows the invitation to Islam with warfare against those who reject it.
Here, we'll come on down in front and work our way back and over.
Hi, Dr. Spencer. My name is Kevin Mooney with the Cybercast News Service. This past election, I understand a Muslim was elected a member of Congress, and I'm wondering if that opens the door to any untoward influence of U.S. policy that would concern you.
Well, you know, one congressman is one congressman, and there are 434 others. My concerns about Keith Ellison are about the money he's taken from the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and the fact that the Council on American-Islamic Relations has never come clean about the fact that two of the co-founders came from the Islamic Association for Palestine, which was a Hamas group, and that Nihad Awad, one of them, has declared his support for Hamas in the past, which he only disavowed recently in during the time of the Ellison campaign. And that several CARE officials have declared that they would like to see the United States become an Islamic state, even by peaceful means. I'm glad that they want to do it by peaceful means, but I find that the fact that they share the same ultimate goal as the jihadists, I don't find that reassuring. And I would like to know what Keith Ellison's ultimate intentions are. Would he like to see the United States Constitution replaced by Islamic Sharia law? And I think these are questions, unfortunately, that people were afraid to ask him because they didn't want to be politically incorrect and be tarred as bigots. Well, you know, there's no bigotry in trying to defend the United States Constitution and in trying to be alert to possible threats to it. President Kennedy was very forthright in dealing with the religious issue when it was completely spurious and based on prejudice and hysteria and real bigotry towards Catholics. When you have Islamic spokesmen around the world saying they want to establish Islamic law over the West, it is not at all bigotry to ask Keith Ellison what he thinks of that. But it hasn't been done yet, as far as I know.
Al Milliken, affiliated with Washington Independent Writers. Those that promote democracy and even look at that as a kind of religion, how do you reconcile their thinking with going into Muslim-dominated societies? How can democracy not support Sharia law when the majority of a population is Muslim?
Democracy will support Sharia law. It has supported Sharia law. Sharia law is the highest law of the land. No law can be made that contradicts the principles of Islam, according to the Iraqi constitution and according to the Afghan constitution. And people were fooled. They thought because the Afghan constitution in particular also guaranteed freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, that that was at war ultimately with Sharia. Well, we saw which one won out with the Abdurrahman case, when a convert from Islam to Christianity was placed on trial, a trial with a death penalty offense for converting. It showed that Islamic law reigns supreme. We have seen that again and again and again. And so every time there is a democratic election in the Islamic world, the jihadists have either won or made significant gains. They obviously have the initiative in the Islamic world today. And so, you know, I wrote before any troops were in Iraq, I wrote in early 2003 that any attempt to democratize the Islamic world, and Iraq in particular, would fail because Islam has a character and always has had a character as a political and social system, as well as an individual religious faith. Now, I appreciate the President's strong stand against terrorism, but I think that we need to defend ourselves and consider that American defense is our first priority, and not undertake these Wilsonian schemes that I think are doomed to failure at the beginning to try to remake societies in the Islamic world. He likes to invoke Japan and Germany after World War II, but in Japan and Germany after World War II, the ideologies that fueled the militarism that had led to the war were discredited. The emperor said he wasn't a god, Nazism was broken. Nobody's going to stand up in 1946 and say he was a Nazi in Berlin. But political Islam has not been discredited. It's not even been challenged. And so how can it do anything but win out?
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss with the Center for Security Policy. Hi. You mentioned that the mosques and madrasas in Pakistan, and I think you said Egypt, are teaching radical Wahhabi Islam. And I know Nina Shea is very focused on trying to get the Saudis to stop sending the radical books to the mosques and madrasas here, 80% of which are very extreme. And my question is, instead of focusing on how to force other countries not to teach it or how to force other countries not to send things here, what can we do to stop this country from having 80% of radical mosques and madrasas, and why can't we do it?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think we can't do it because of the fact that this is a religion. And people think, well, this is freedom of religion. We can't interfere with freedom of religion. But you know something, just to take a very small example, the year 1 in the Islamic calendar, you know that there's an Islamic calendar that differs from the calendar that we use. The year 1 is not what you might expect. Sometimes when I'm speaking around the country, I ask audiences, what do you think the year 1 is in the Islamic calendar? And people invariably say, Oh, it must have been when Muhammad was born, or when Muhammad died, or when Muhammad got his first revelation from God. Actually, it's none of those. The year 1 in the Islamic calendar is when Muhammad became a political and military leader, when he fled with the Hijrah, when he fled from Mecca to Medina and became for the first time a political leader, the leader of a polity. That's the year 1, and that, I think, is an essential, there's encapsulated in that an essential point, and that is that Islam is political inherently. It's a political ideology as much as it is a religion in the Western sense. And it needs to be approached by the government, by law enforcement as such, and subject to all the regulation of a political group. And I think that would do a great deal, were that approach adopted, to clarify what we can do and should do about what's being taught in the mosques. I mean, this has been going on for years. In 1999, 2 years before 9/11, Sheikh Mohammed Hisham Kabani, a Sufi sheikh, a Muslim himself, toured American mosques. He visited 114 American mosques, and then he testified before a State Department open forum that 80% of American mosques were under the control of extremists. This tallies with the amount of Saudi money that those mosques have been receiving in the United States, and it also tallies with the 2005 report that Deborah Weiss mentioned from Freedom House, which went into American mosques again and found incredible, breathtaking hate literature and Islamic supremacism being taught in those mosques and Islamic schools. This is a scandal. It's a national scandal, and nobody's paying attention to it. I think here again, out of political correctness and fear.
We'll take one more on this side, and then I'll go over here.
What do you think the next 2 to 4 years, Robert, as far as foreign policy is concerned, what do you think is the best thing the United States can do? Obviously, something with Saudi Arabia. What do you think in Saudi Arabia? What do you think in Iraq and with Iran?
Okay.
That's a simple question.
Yes. If I am elected, in Saudi Arabia, in the first place, we should have initiated, and need to initiate today, a full-scale, all-out effort, a Manhattan Project, to find alternative energy sources. We need to challenge the environmentalists over the Alaskan oil reserves. We need to understand this as matters of national security and national survival. We need to bring pressure to bear on the Saudis because, after all, it is not the seller only who holds all the cards. The buyer can put a lot more pressure than we've been doing on them in regard to their activities around the world and in the United States. As far as Iraq goes, I think, as I said before, that the Wilsonian democracy project is doomed. It was doomed from the beginning. We should, if not withdraw entirely, then at least redeploy our troops into defensive mode so as to defend ourselves and the surrounding countries against jihadist elements from Iraq. But as far as what they do with their own country, that's an internal matter, and that's up to them. If there's civil war in Iraq, I'm sorry, but it's not our responsibility as Americans to make sure there are no civil wars anywhere. And Iraq is a fictional polity to start with that was cobbled together out of 3 Ottoman provinces by the British. It doesn't have any essential unity. Why is it so necessary to keep it together? Why do we have to spend American lives to keep it together? I'm not saying it was wrong to topple Saddam Hussein, but that's a different question from whether a democracy in Iraq is even possible to be established. As far as Iran goes, if they don't have nuclear weapons already, they're going to have them very soon. President Ahmadinejad has been very clear. He repeated his genocidal intentions against Israel just the other day, said Israel will soon cease to exist. If Israel is our ally, and if we have any sense of our own self-interest in the larger sense against the global jihad, which Iran is trying to position itself now as the leader of, and is working with al-Qaeda together to become that leader, if we have any sense of any of these things, then we have to strike the nuclear program before it's too late. I don't think there's any way around that.
Hello, my name is Wes Saeed, full life. I had a question, because there was a recent conference in Boston that the Ayn Rand Institute held, and there was a packed panel. And the discussion was characterizing the same type of methods used in Islam, and what you were discussing in terms of forming these totalitarian regimes based on interpretation of the Quran, etc. And some of the solutions that were brought up from Yaron Brook and John Lewis were to use the same methods that the United States used against Japan,
Yes.
giving the example of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
No. John
to
Lewis,
deal.
actually, he adduced a document that was written by General MacArthur, as I recall. I could be wrong about that, but in any case, it was an official document of the American occupying authorities in Japan during the time of the occupation. And it said that Shinto as an individual religious faith must not be interfered with. However, Shinto as a political ideology has to be actively resisted, and it must have no place in the government or in the schools. And Lewis, I think, expatiated on that very, very eloquently, and I entirely agree that political Islam ought to be confronted in exactly the same way. Islam as an individual religious faith must not be interfered with, but should have no presence in Iraq or elsewhere in the government or the schools, and then only by such means can the equality of rights of religious minorities and of women be protected. But as far as Hiroshima and Nagasaki and nuking somebody, nobody's talking about that.
Thank you so much for addressing this most important, yet most taboo issue that the world is facing today, and that our politicians, our intellectuals, our media basically make sure that they slide under the rug.
Yes, they do.
I came from France, and I'm afraid my country is on the verge of collapse, the way I see it, for the simple reason of the synergy between socialism, which has destroyed the economy, and, of course, the political movement of Islam, whereby the demographic bomb has basically suffocated the ability of the traditional French to fight back while appeasing this growing problem. And I think this issue needs to be addressed. The fact that basically it grows very fast and suffocates economically, and therefore exacerbates the tensions.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. The policies that have been adopted in Western Europe for the last 30 years are suicidal, ultimately. They entered into a series of agreements with the Arab League, the European Commission, and then the European Union that were a result of the oil crisis, rather, of 1973. The Europeans were frightened by the oil crisis of 1973 and wanted to ensure a steady supply of oil. In order to do so, these agreements that they entered into with the Arab League, which are all laid out in great detail in Batya Or's great book, Eurabia, which I highly recommend to all of you, you will find in those agreements that they guaranteed large-scale immigration from Muslim societies, but absolutely forswore any attempt to assimilate those new immigrants. Now, it's ironic now that the French have been criticized for not assimilating their Muslim immigrants when they told the Arab League they wouldn't, at the insistence of the Arab League. The Arab League wanted to form Islamic enclaves in France and elsewhere, and they have succeeded in doing so. It is not the fault of it is the fault of the European governments, but not because of some kind of discrimination or racism or neglect. It is because of explicit agreements that they have entered into, that they are honoring. Now, the demographic trends are very bad. As you say, there will be, unless things change drastically, Islamic majorities in several countries in Western Europe before the end of this century. And then we're going to see, since nobody is even daring to ask questions about the allegiance of these Muslims in these countries to Islamic law and their intentions to impose it over their new countries, nobody's even asking the questions. Thus, they are able to work unabated. And as you say, all there has been is appeasement in response. To a degree that's really, the degree of denial in this never ceases to amaze me. I was speaking at a conference a few months ago, and there were a number of officials there, American and European officials, and one by one they got up and they said, well, the first thing we want to make sure that everybody knows is that Islam has nothing to do with this problem. And we know that this is not a problem with the religion of Islam. The overwhelming majority of Muslims in our countries are completely on our side, completely loyal citizens, and we're very happy to have them here. And then in practically the next breath, they said, the only thing is we can't find imams to work with. Every time we find an imam that we think is moderate, he turns out to be a jihadist. And it never seemed to occur to them that if there was these overwhelming majority of loyal, peaceful Muslims, then how is it that they didn't seem to have any leaders? But the contradiction was not apparent. And I think that this is just emblematic of the denial and the wishful thinking that unfortunately is passing for policy in Europe and America today.
Larry Kelly, San Francisco. I'm a contributor to Human Events also. Do you see also that if you look historically from the time that the Muslim armies rode out of Arabia and have been attacking the infidel, both the West and Persia, that what we're seeing also is really just a continuation of the war that Islam has waged on the West? That's question A. And question B, what are your recommendations for Islamic immigration into the United States going forward?
Yes, thank you. A couple things. Of course this is a continuation. You know, there's so many things about this issue that, as the shadow would say, have the power to cloud men's minds. And one of them is the fact that if you go back 50 years, 75 years, you didn't see this kind of jihad activity against the West. And people think, therefore, that because we're only seeing it really since the Khomeini revolution in Iran, that it is something newly minted. And they then jump to the assumption that, therefore, it is a new heretical movement within the Islamic world that contradicts the true teachings of Islam and can, therefore, be relatively easily eradicated. Unfortunately, however, that's not the case. These things are, as I tried to outline in the talk, very deeply rooted within Islamic teaching. And there was never a rejection of the ideologies that fueled those Islamic conquests of the past. There was never a reformation or a repudiation of the idea that Muslims must fight in order to establish the hegemony of Islamic law. What happened was, in the colonial period, and a few centuries preceding the colonial period, because of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, the jihad became quiescent, or relatively quiescent, with some notable exceptions. And it was simply not possible. The Islamic world was not strong enough to pursue it. But they never rejected it as a principle. And then Saudi oil billions and the Khomeini revolution did once again make for the possibility that these things could be pursued. And that's why we're seeing them resurgent today. But it's exactly the same motion. It's exactly the same ideology. The second question was, I'm sorry.
Immigration.
Immigration,
what
yeah.
impact do you think?
Well, obviously, we don't want to do anything that would contradict the principles of freedom of religion that are enshrined in the Constitution. But as I have been explaining, there are political elements of Islam that I think can be addressed. I think one of the things that we could do very basically is revise the immigration application, revise visa applications and even applications for student study and so on, to ask very specific questions about the status of women, about the status of religious minorities, about living in a pluralistic society as equals with people who are not believers, and various questions of this kind. Actually, I've developed a draft of this. If I can interest any congressmen or senators in taking a look, just give me a call. But I think that that's how it can be tackled on a very specific basis. Not that we would expect true answers or honest answers to these questions, but once the questions were asked, then a false answer, a dishonest answer, would then become grounds for deportation if activity to the contrary of the answer followed.
Hello, Mr. Spencer.
Hello.
My name is Megan from Boston. You were bringing up that Muhammad is promoting practices such as child marriage, other such things. I was curious as to whether you think that Republican Congressman Mark Foley was perhaps under the influence of the evil teachings of Muhammad.
No. I never said that child molestation or pedophilia or anything of the kind was exclusively the province of Muslims. What I'm talking about is when you give this kind of behavior explicit sanction in religious texts, and according to the example of the founder of the religion, it becomes very much more difficult to eradicate. But just in case anyone is confused or concerned, I do not think that this kind of behavior is restricted to the Islamic world by any means, and I disapprove of it from Mark Foley or from anyone else.
David Black, Washington, D.C. The Protestant Reformation was a response to a perceived abuse of political power as much as it was a disagreement about theology. Are you saying that my question was going to be, so how do we foment the equivalent Reformation on the Muslim side? Or do you think it's impossible?
The Reformation in the Islamic world would have to be of a very different character. The Protestant Reformation, whether one is a Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox, the stated goal of the Protestant Reformation, in other words, however one may view it with approval or disapproval, was to get back to the original texts, to get back to the original teachings, to peel away all these things that had supposedly crept into Christianity over the centuries, and to get back to the basic thing. Now, whether or not they succeeded in that, whether or not that was a successful enterprise is a question for another day, but that was the intention. Unfortunately, there has already been a reformation of that kind within Islam. That is Wahhabism. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was an 18th century reformer who had believed that various things that were un-Islamic had crept into the practice of Islam. And so he determined to remove them and to restrict the practice of Islam only to what the Quran clearly taught, what Muhammad clearly taught, and what had been practiced in the first 2 centuries after Muhammad. So that's a reformation. What we need here, because these doctrines are so deeply embedded within the texts, is more like a rejection of literalism, a retreat from literalism, a formulation of some kind of Islam that would be roughly analogous to Unitarian or Episcopalian Christianity that doesn't take the text seriously at all. And I don't mean any offense to any, but in any case, I think that's a generally accurate statement, and that's the kind of thing that we need to see. And there are several very courageous Muslim spokesmen who've called for that. Tashbi Sayyid of Muslim World Today is one of them, and there are some others who I think deserve all our full support, but we shouldn't have any illusions about this. Literalism is very deeply ingrained within Islam. It is the mainstream in Islam in a way that it never was in Christianity, and will be that much harder to eradicate as a result.
I think we're running short on time, and I know you're going to be out in front with your books. We do have copies of the book for sale, and for his autographing, and you are welcome to talk to him outside, sir. I am at time limits here inside, but do thank our guest again for joining us.
Thanks very much.
And we look forward to seeing you on a future occasion. Thank you very much.
I know you're not a terrorist, my friend. I thought you were